In this video I want to give you a few practical tips on how to master modulation on the Grandmother and troubleshoot patching issues before they are even happening. And before we are jumping into the tips, let me first explain what modulation is even doing. So modulation means that we are using a signal or a parameter to change a different parameter over time without having to do it manually. And the most common modulation source is the envelope to the volume to the VCA. So depending on the envelope stages, we can change the volume without having to use the volume knob here. So if we turn up the attack, it will take a certain while till the volume reaches the full amount. So that would be the simplest way of modulating. So we have a module on the synth that is interacting with a different parameter inside the synth, so we are able to change it over time. Another important principle you should know about when it comes to modulation is that we have modulation sources and modulation destinations. And on the Moog Grandmother it's nicely labeled because all the outputs, all the modulation sources have these box labels here, or inputs have no box labels. And that's the first way how you could troubleshoot your modulation patching. So it doesn't make sense to patch an output into an output, because both of these outputs want to be patched into an input, and it also doesn't make sense to patch an input to an input because both of the inputs are waiting for a source signal. Let's first talk about what modulation sources we have available, and before you are even starting to patch, it's always smart to ask yourself, what modulation source am I taking? What is the modulation source doing? What kind of voltage is it providing? And what will happen if I patch it into the modulation destination? And the modulation sources we have available on the Moog Grandmother are the LFO, the most obvious one, so a repeating waveform. We have the envelope available. That's a little bit different than the waveform because it's not always repeating. It gets triggered as soon as you are pressing a key, or if we send something into the trigger in, then it's following the stages that we are setting with the controls we have available. So we can actually shape the modulation more with an envelope compared to a waveform, because these waveforms are basically repeating all the time and we don't really have the power to change these modulating waveforms. Then we have the sample and hold output. This is a little bit different to the waveform, so to the envelope, because it's not outputting predictable voltage, it's outputting near random step voltages. It's always repeating all the time like a waveform, but we can't really predict what's happening because it's random stepped voltage. And it's not smooth in any way, it's giving us these stepped random voltages to randomized parameters. Then we have the gate out, keyboard out, and keyboard velocity out, and these modulation sources are closely related to the keyboard of the Moog Grandmother. Let's first talk about what gate out is doing. So as soon as you are pressing a key, and as long as you are pressing a key, the gate out will send a control voltage. So if you press a key, there will be a voltage. If you let go of the key, there will be no voltage. And there's actually an internal connection to the envelope. So as soon as you are pressing a key, there is a gate signal being sent to the envelope to trigger it, and then it's running through the envelope stages. The keyboard out is also internally linked to a few destinations, and what the keyboard out is doing is, depending on the keys you are pressing, it's sending a different voltage. So lower keys will send less voltage compared to higher keys, and it's internally linked to the filter. So if you turn on the keyboard track, that's exactly what the keyboard out is doing. The filter will be closed on lower notes and opened on higher notes, because there's more voltage opening up the filter cutoff. The key presses are also linked to the oscillators internally, so it's changing how fast or slow an oscillator is running. Lower notes meaning slower waveforms, higher notes meaning faster waveforms, and depending on the key presses we can change how fast or slow an oscillator is running, effectively changing the pitch of the oscillator. Then we have the keyboard velocity out, and this will send voltages based on how hard you are pressing the key with which velocity. And that's not internally linked, but it can be used to open the filter depending on how hard you are pressing a key, or making the synth velocity sensitive, meaning pressing notes with more velocity makes the synth louder, pressing with less velocity makes it quieter. Now that we've talked about all the modulation sources we have available on the Moog Grandmother, let's talk about the modulation destinations we have available. The first modulation destination we have available is the pitch in. It's kind of similar to the rate in of the modulating oscillator, because the rate or the speed of the waveform is directly referring to the pitch of the oscillator. So faster waveforms mean higher pitch. If we are patching something in the pitch in, so kind of the rate in of the oscillator, we can change the rate and the pitch of the oscillator. Then we have pulse width modulation. This is only working for a square or for a pulse wave. And pulse width modulation means we are changing the duty cycle of the square and of the pulse wave, giving us different timbres. And you have to think about the square waveform like 50% voltage on and 50% voltage off. And for the pulse wave, it's a little bit different. There's like 10 or 20% of voltage on and 80 or 90% of voltage off. And with the pulse width modulation, we can set how much of voltage should be on or off in one waveform cycle. So based on the pulse width modulation, we can either set fixed values or we can make it move over time, changing the pulse width, so the duty cycle of the waveform. Then we have filter cutoff modulation. I think this one is pretty clear for now. It will just change the cutoff over time. Then we have the VCA amount in or volume modulation, so changing the volume of the synth. And something we could also do on the Moog Grandmother is saturation or distortion modulation by sending an LFO or a different modulation signal into the mixer, and then we are able to overdrive the mixer, kind of creating saturation or modulation-like effects, but more on this in a second. Now that we've talked about the modulation sources and destinations, let's talk about the speed of the modulation and of the depth, because that's really important. The modulation wheel or the attenuator let us set how much of modulation depth we want. And when I'm talking about modulation depth, it's meaning how much of the modulation source is affecting the modulation destination. With the mod wheel, you can set this so we can only have a little bit of modulation. Let's try this for a second for the filter cutoff. So a lot or less, so how much depth of the modulation will be applied. So if it's basically moving in small steps or in these big steps, that's exactly what the modulation wheel is doing. And if you are patching something through the attenuator, we can do the same thing. So if you would go from the wave out in the attenuator input into the output into the cutoff in, we don't need the modulation wheel because the attenuator is now setting how much modulation depth we want. And then something else that's really important is the modulation speed, because at slow speeds we are hearing the modulation because it's moving a parameter, so we can hear the movement. But at really fast speeds, so-called audio rates, it's actually producing a new frequency. So you should always ask yourself, what do you want to achieve with modulation? Do you want to have a slow moving sound, or do you want to use modulation to achieve new frequencies? Because audio rate modulation is the big thing of the Moog Grandmother and the secret to access new frequencies, harsher, more metallic and aggressive sounds, compared to slow modulation that are basically just used for movement of a sound. Another thing before we are going into more principles of modulation is key tracked modulation, because right now the LFO is running at a certain speed, and if you are pressing keys, the speed will not change, it will always stays the same. It will open and close the filter cutoff based on the rate we are setting here. But by patching the keyboard out into the rate in, we can change the rate depending on the keys we are pressing. And now we can change how fast or slow the modulation should be, if it should be a little bit more dynamic or really static. So lower keys will have slower modulation compared to higher keys, and that's really important for audio rate modulation, because if we are creating new frequencies with audio rate modulation, it works best with key track modulation, meaning changing the rate of modulation. And let me show you this for the filter cutoff. I think that's the best way to hear it. Let's first do it without the keyboard out to the rate in and turn it up really fast into audio rates, so we are creating new frequencies. You can hear we have this new frequency available that's locked in on this one key, but if you play a different key, this nice frequency that we've created with audio rate modulation won't be audible on the different notes. So we can kind of lock in this new audio rate frequency we've just created by going from keyboard out into the rate in, effectively changing the rate based on the keys we are pressing, and now we can really dial in our audio rate frequencies. And this frequency is now the same. And before we are creating a few modulation patches, let's talk about how we can troubleshoot false modulation connections before they are even happening. Because avoiding bad modulation practice is basically just asking yourself if it makes sense to send the signal somewhere. And let's maybe do a few patches that doesn't make sense at all. And I'm just showing you the process of how I'm approaching this modulation. So the first thing I'm going to do is patching a few modulation sources into modulation destinations, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And the first one is the keyboard out into the sync in. If we patch something into the sync in, we are restarting the LFO waveform from the beginning, because normally the LFO waveform is just a free running waveform and it's just somewhere in a cycle repeating over and over again. And it's not restarting on any key press or on any signal if we are not sending something in. Let me show you why it doesn't make sense to patch keyboard out into the sync in. So ask yourself, what is keyboard out doing? Okay, keyboard out is giving us signal based on the keys we are pressing. And sync in is waiting for kind of a gate or trigger signal to say, okay, now I need to restart the waveform. And because we kind of have smooth values of voltage, we can't really tell at which point on the keyboard we are restarting the waveform. So there will be no real effect if you listen to it. It's not restarting the waveform because we can predict at which keys it will restart the waveform. The same for the keyboard velocity out. It doesn't make much sense because now we are sending different voltages based on how hard we are pressing the keys, and we can also not really predict when this will happen. But if we are sending the gate out into the sync in, that makes a lot more sense, because the gate out gives us a signal as soon as we are pressing the key. So it's just a voltage spike as long as we're pressing the key, and then it will stop. And the sync in is actually waiting for a signal like this. So each time you are pressing a key, we are restarting the LFO waveform, and that's a great way to get more precise modulation. Let's first do it without, and you hear each new key will have a different filter position because we are in a random value of the waveform. But the gate out into the sync in will forces the LFO to restart with each key press, and now we are getting the same modulation each time you are pressing a key. So just from a logical perspective, it doesn't make sense to take the keyboard out and keyboard velocity out. And it's important that you know what your modulation sources are doing, what they are outputting, and what your modulation destinations want to receive. I think that's the most important part about modulation. So if you don't know what your outputs, your sources will do, you can't really predict what they will do to the destination. So if you want to get better at modulation, the first thing I would recommend is sit down on your Moog Grandmother, check out all the sources, all the destinations, and ask yourself what they want to receive, what they are doing, what the sources are outputting, and what the destinations want to receive. And again, let's create a patch that doesn't make a lot of sense. So if we go from the keyboard out into the pitch in, again, if we're asking ourselves what the keyboard out is doing, sending different control voltages based on the key presses into the pitch in. So we are changing the pitch based on different key presses, and as you can probably guess, does make a lot of sense because now the pitching is all over the place. Because the keyboard voltages are internally linked to the oscillators, meaning pressing a lower key will make the oscillator run slower, playing a higher key will make the oscillator run faster, and by sending this signal again into the pitch in, we are overwriting it, completely destroying the pitches. But if we are sending this into the pulse width modulation in, it makes a lot more sense because the pulse width modulation will change the duty cycle of the waveforms, creating new timbres, not completely destroying the pitch of the oscillators, and now we can get different timbres depending on the keys we are pressing. The same for the keyboard velocity out. If you patch it into the pitch in, we are changing the oscillator pitch based on different velocities. And we have unpredicted notes, doesn't make a lot of sense. Patching it into the pulse width modulation in will change the pulse width, the timbre, based on the velocity. But there's a way how we could still utilize the pitch of, for example, oscillator 2, because if we are hard synchronizing it, we are not completely destroying the pitch, we are rather changing the timbre because the second oscillator is synced to the first oscillator and the pitch changes are not that harsh. It will rather give us different timbres. And if we're now asking ourselves if it makes sense to patch in the gate out, I mean, at first we are pressing a key and then jumping to a certain value, to a certain voltage. So we are changing the pitch to a certain voltage. And then you let go of the key and it will stop. So doesn't make a lot of sense on its own. But if you think about it, it will only send the voltage as long as we are pressing a key. And because it's instantly stopping, we are not hearing a difference. But if you give it release, we can jump between two voltage states, or essentially between two hard sync pitch states. that can maybe be heard a little bit better with the pulse width modulation. And so as when we are pressing a key, it's going to a certain value and then falling back because we are letting go, jumping to its initial value, but the release will still play the note. And the gate out, keyboard out and keyboard velocity out are a little bit tricky to master, but once you understand what these sources will do, you are able to use them in patches and make sense of them. I think all the other modulation sources are a little bit easier to handle. So let's jump to these modulation sources. So the first one we have available is the wave out. It will give us the LFO waveform. And here you can basically patch it into anything without really have to worry. Of course, there are a few modulation destinations that make a little bit more sense. So again, let's do a few patches and ask ourselves if this will make sense in any kind. I patch it from the wave out into the pitch in, and now we are changing the pitch of the oscillator with the LFO, and in a musical context that might not make much sense, but if we again go the route through the pitch in of oscillator 2, hard sync it, makes a little bit more sense because instead of these harsh pitch changes we are getting different timbres. The same for the pulse width modulation in. That's a really great use case, and that's the reason because there's also a dedicated pulse width amount knob. If you send the wave out into the linear FM in slow rates, we are essentially changing a little bit of the pitch of the oscillator. Because pitch in and linear FM in are really similar, they will change the pitch of the oscillator, just that the linear FM in will do it in a linear way, it's linear frequency modulation. But if you patch something into the pitch in, it's also frequency modulation, but the linear frequency modulation is just doing it in a different way, in a linear way. And for the linear FM in, audio rate modulation comes in really handy because now we are able to create new pitches, new frequencies based on this audio rate modulation. And like we've discussed before, it makes a lot of sense to track your audio rate modulation to kind of lock in the frequencies we are creating. Let's check out the sample and hold, so basically random step voltages. If you patch it into the pitch of oscillator 1, we are changing the pitch of oscillator 1 in a random way. Maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense. Into the pulse width modulation in makes more sense because we are getting different timbres in a random way based on the sample and hold random step voltages. If you patch it into the linear FM in, it also doesn't make a lot of sense because we are getting random messy pitch changes at slow rates. That doesn't sound really great. And at high rates it's the same. Like not a cycling repeating waveform that we can tame in a way, it's just like random voltage. That doesn't work really well for the linear frequency modulation. Let's take a quick look at the filter. It doesn't make a lot of sense to send the modulating LFO into the input because the input is waiting for audio signal from the oscillators. But what makes sense is to send it into the envelope amount in because now we are able to change the envelope amount based on our LFO, and that can result in some more interesting envelope shapes. I think we don't have to talk about patching the wave into the cutoff in because there's an internal connection. What's about the sample and hold? This would also make sense because now we can change the envelope in a random way. Same for the cutoff in, that it can also make sense because now we can get these nice random step filters. And if we take the wave out into the trigger in, that also makes sense because now the envelope gets triggered and the cycle is getting started by the LFO. Sample and hold can also make sense because now this is in a random way. But the keyboard out doesn't make a lot of sense because now the envelope is not triggering, it's only triggering at a certain value, at a certain key value, and again, we don't know when this will happen. The same for the keyboard velocity out. Low values will not trigger the envelope, but high values, and we cannot really predict it. And patching it through the gate out also doesn't really make a lot of sense because this connection is already internally happening. So each time you are pressing a key, the envelope gets triggered, so the keys are basically sending a gate signal to the envelope in to trigger it. Let's send the wave out into the VCA mount in. That can also make sense because now we are changing the volume of the synth, the VCA amount, based on LFO, and that's the way how we can get tremolo effects. Or at audio rates we can create amplitude modulation. And again, now the keyboard out into the rate in can make sense. The same for sample and hold out, that can also make sense because we are changing the volume with random steps. If you set in the gate out, to be honest, it doesn't make a lot of sense because we are raising the volume. If you let go, it falls down to a volume, and we could do this with the envelope, so actually no real use case. If we send the keyboard out into the VCA mount in, different keys will make the synth louder. Can make sense, but I think there are better ways to use the VCA mount in. For example, the keyboard velocity out. This makes a lot of sense because if you're asking yourself what the keyboard velocity out is doing, sending velocity values to the volume, and now we can truly make the synth velocity sensitive, meaning keys with less velocity will be quieter compared to keys with high velocity. If we are using oscillator wave out to send it to the VCA mount in, we are basically doing amplitude modulation because the oscillators are running at audio rates. But it's kind of hard to fine-tune, so I would recommend to use the wave out from the modulating oscillator. Going from the mixer out also maybe doesn't make a lot of sense if we are using the oscillators inside the mixer, because then we are using the combined oscillator signal to modulate the VCA mount in. Let's talk about the VCA and the reverb in. It doesn't make a lot of sense to patch control voltage or modulation signal into the VCA or into the reverb in, because these two connections want to receive audio signal, because the VCA is the last step, the last instance before the signal is going into the reverb, and this is most of the time used if we are combining filters or different audio and want to get it back into the signal path. So if you would send a slow LFO into the VCA in, we are basically overwriting the internal signal path completely, and only the waveform of the modulating oscillator will be in the VCA. At slow rates we are not able to hear something. We are only able to hear something if you turn it up fast enough, because then we are in audio rates. So this connection also doesn't make a lot of sense. Same for the reverb in. I think the reverb and the VCA in are most useful if you want to send in audio signals either from the wave outs of the oscillators, from the mixer output to send a combined audio signal, or from one of the filters. Let's take a closer look at the mixer, because we can override the internal mixer connections. And if you send the wave out into the noise in and turn it down completely, turn it up, we are again not able to hear it because we are not in audio rate. If you turn it up fast enough, we are able to hear a signal, but we can use these slow LFO forms to push in an oscillator into saturation rhythmically. What the mixer knobs are basically doing, they are setting how much voltage is flowing through the mixer, and at a certain point the mixer can't handle it anymore and will start to overdrive, will saturate, will distort it. And that's nothing bad. The mixer is intended to work like this, so we are able to get saturation-like effects. And if you now have an oscillator that is already near overdriving, and if we are sending an LFO in, that is basically just sending in different voltage states, we can drive this oscillator into distortion rhythmically with the voltage we are sending into the noise in now. And I think a great way to hear is on the triangle wave. And now we are driving in more voltage with the LFO in a rhythmical way. Another way to get better modulation is to fine-tune the speed and the modulation depth. We could either do this with the mod wheel or by going out from an attenuator. So let's take the wave out, send it into the attenuator, And let's take the modulation signal into the mold. And what the mold is doing, it will multiply the modulation signal, so we are able to send it to multiple sources. Let's maybe send one into the pitch in of oscillator 2 in hard sync, and another one is going into the pulse width modulation of oscillator 2. And now with the attenuator we can fine tune how much of the signal we want, and with the rate we can fine tune the speed of the modulation. And another thing you could do on the Moog Grandmother to fine tune the rate is pressing shift and now turning up the rate, and now it will only move in little steps compared to big steps. You can also see it on the blinking LED. If you turn it up, it's blinking really fast, but if you press the hold, it's not jumping in these big steps. So that's another tip. Fine tune your modulation. That's really important, especially for audio rate modulation. Then fine tuning is mandatory. If you want to learn more about modulation concepts and a few clever patching tricks, click the first link in the description to watch a free lesson of the full Moog Grandmother course, where I'm guiding you from the beginning principles of analog sound design into more advanced semi-modular sound design. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you soon.